Okay, folks, I'm going to start this evening's proceedings. Apologies for the late start. We often start late. My excuse tonight, as I'm the one actually running the program, is that I've actually dashed here straight from the protests in sort of central Bangkok to launch this book on the 14th of October. I planned it with Sunisa because of the synchronicity of the dates, being the anniversary of the 1973 protests, which you could argue were the sort of beginning of significant mass protest movements in Thailand in the modern era, which led to the ouster of then dictator Tanom Kittikachorn, and the beginnings of a left-wing movement, and that all then came to a very horrible end 3 years later in another protest and clash and eventually a massacre at Thammasat University on the 6th of October 1976. And so the idea, Sunisa and I felt, was this was a good date. And so we chose this. After we chose this date to launch this very important book, the current student protest movement decided that they were also going to hold a big... They'd originally said they were going to have a mass strike, but it's turned into a protest. I am the BBC correspondent here, and I don't always have a whole lot of news to do, so when something happens, it's my duty to rush off and cover it. So I'm a little sweaty. I've been running around from Ratchadam Nern up to Ban Pitsenalok. At one point, we really thought there might be clashes between royalist and anti-royalist protesters out there because both groups were there. There was a chance that the king was going to go past his motorcade. There was a lot of tension. That was dissipated. But it's been quite a busy day, and busier than I thought it was going to be. So I'm absolutely delighted today to be launching this book on this date. I've read the book. Any of you who haven't, I really urge you to do it. It's got an absolute fantastic sense of place. Anyone who knows Thailand and Thai history and has some sense of what happened, you will feel like you're back there, living through these events. And you've got these compelling characters, this superb ménage à trois between the three main characters in the book. So it is definitely a gripping read and well worth going with. Before we start, I'd just quickly like to alert you to one event we've got coming up because it's very important, which is the event we've got tomorrow on Myanmar. Myanmar's holding a general election next month, or should be. The country is currently suffering from a very severe spike in COVID-19 numbers. And it is a very different Aung San Suu Kyi from the image she had 5 years ago, who will be competing to retain her hold on power there. A lot of very important issues. And we've got a fantastic panel tomorrow who will be running through all of those issues. And so I do urge you, if you can, if possible, to come to that meeting. It'll be very illuminating. There's a lot to cover. But let's start with tonight's event. I've got Sunisa Manning herself, who has been brought up in Thailand. Her father's here, so I don't have to say a lot about her family, but like so many people in Thailand, she is what we call Luk Krung. My kids are Luk Krung too, half Thai, half American, a foot in both cultures, has done a number of residences in the States writing and has been recognized for the quality of her writing, but has spent, she says, 5 to 6 years doing this book, which in a way digs deep into Thailand's troubled past. And I think for anybody who is Thai or half Thai or has Thai family, when you start asking questions about the past, you realize how many questions are unanswered and how many questions have been buried. And that's the context which has driven and motivated Sunisa to write this book. But we're also bringing in Jasmine Cheer from London. Jasmine is a young Thai journalist whose writing you probably have seen if you read the brilliant new publication Thai Inquirer, which was launched at the beginning of this month. And there's been some fantastic stuff done by Jasmine, looking into the past, studying those past protest movements and looking into the issue of memory and how it's been suppressed in Thailand. So I'd like to start. I'm going to introduce the book, but actually I think it would be nicer if I asked Sunisa herself to talk a little bit about this book, what drove you to write it and put so much of your life into it. In which time I think you'd become a mother for the first time while you were writing it, and that sort of, the origins of being half Thai, being American, how that sort of also fueled your drive to get this book out. Sunisa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. How's the sound? Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan, for hosting, and the FCCT for hosting, and Jasmine for joining us. I really appreciate it on today of all days. What drove me to write this book? A couple things. Flannery O'Connor has a great quote about how I'm going to butcher it, but something like the terrain of your childhood will give you enough novels for a lifetime. And since I was born and raised in Bangkok, I knew I would write about Bangkok. One thing that drew me to the events that spanned between October 14th of 73 and October 6th of 76 was this expression that crosses the face of many Thai people when you ask about it. It used to be that really absolutely no one would talk about it in a kind of official way, but if you're Thai and you have Thai family or very close friends, they would acknowledge it. And for me growing up, there was an expression of pain and I think shame that it really made me wonder what had happened then. And, the events of the novel that I wrote occurred before I was born, but that was a seed that started me into my research. Also, I was looking for a time where I had been thinking about and continue to think a lot about opportunity in Thailand for people who are not born with a lot of connections, not high society, as we say, high so. And this is a period where there was a mass movement to increase access for everyday people. And I increasingly got more and more drawn to that for that reason.
Thank you, Sunisa. We're very keen to get you to read parts of your book, but before we bring you in with a first reading from early on in the book, where we actually learn a little bit about these characters in her book, these three critical characters. Jasmine, you're in the rare privilege, like me, of having read the book. Not many people here have, I think, unless it's only been available for quite a short time. Could you give us first your own impressions of the book and how it relates in your mind to the tradition, the understanding Thailand has of the past protests, and that tradition of dissent, which has clearly deeply inspired today's student movement?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks, Sunisa, obviously, for having me. It's one of those very rare books because usually when you read books in English about Thailand, you're reading about, that person's experience in Thailand, but rarely about the nation's experience. And I think Sunisa is right in that 1973 and 76 was this very collective moment for the people. And I actually think that we're in again, this very uniquely collective moment, whether you're for or against the protests. But really, there is sort of this huge national mobilization. I think that's very rare. But, I'm not going to say too much about the book now because, as you mentioned, Jonathan, we're going to go into it a little bit more, and I'm sure other people will hopefully read it. I think one of the core questions the book asks is, how does the idealism of youth come up against the cruelties of political reality? I think that's a really enduring question and, still the core question for us today. And I want to speak a little bit about the 1973 protests, actually, because they took place in a very different time, but a lot of the features were the same. There had been this discontent against the Tanam government. The protests were taking place against this backdrop of geopolitical unrest. The Cold War was raging. Southeast Asia was the focal point. In the US, there were these serious protests against the Vietnam War. And many of the Thai scholars and intellectuals who studied the US came back to Thailand with these radical ideas that informed the movement. And, the actual spark of the events were really quite similar again. The National Executive Council at the time imposed this decree that allowed the military to have complete control over the judiciary, which, sounds familiar. And then there was this helicopter crash at Tung Yai Naresuan, right, where there were these private officers using government property for personal use to the extreme danger of others. And then finally, you had the editors at student magazines across universities being threatened with expulsion. And so protests that were already raging really gained steam. In that kind of environment, students began to demand change, not just within the government, but there was actually conversation around reforming the monarchy. And I think that's something that Sunisa's book reminds us, right? That a lot of these radical ideas we're seeing today, a lot of the, reading of Jit Pumisak, that had been done in 1973. There was a feminist movement in 1973, right? That was canceling beauty pageants, canceling the Dao Zala, Dao Thammasat. And so I think today we're in this other unique geopolitical moment. The world is leaderless. America's in political turmoil. The Black Lives Matter protests have pushed the whole conversation leftward. And this time, Thai teens on Twitter can actually be a part of that shift leftward. You see people talking about LGBTQ issues on protest stages. And there is this sort of diffusion of issues coming in, both from outside and from within Thailand. And then, the run-up to the current protest is eerily familiar. There's the double standards of the judiciary and the ruling of Future Forward, etc. So I think all this to say, today really does feel like October 1973. But in the tale of the two Octobers, the question has always been, how did October 1973 become October 1976? Yeah. And I think there are going to be those geopolitical answers, right? The fall of Vietnam, and then the domestic answers, right? Sort of the right shift in sort of the Sangha, the monarchy, the government. But there is this deeply personal story to that period that we as political scientists and journalists don't get. How the students became radicalized, what it looked like to have Thai society pulled apart and polarized in that way. And that, I think, is what we get from Sunisa's book that you don't get anywhere else. Oftentimes when we think of protest, we think of it as this very abstract thing, right? Especially among left-leaning journalists, you're like, this is incredible, how hopeful that the students are coming out again. But reading her book, you're reminded that this hopefulness comes with sacrifices. Ideological changes within a single person, let alone a nation, are very difficult. Within a single family, that kind of generational shift in ideas about authority or respect can really wreak havoc. And, sometimes really unexpected things like love or friendship can change a protest movement. And that's what I hope we come to today in our conversation, right? That theme that A Good True Tribe brings up between idealism and reality. Because it's important for us to remember that October 14th was obviously this moment of hope, but one that didn't come without its costs, either at the time or sort of in the near future.
Thanks very much, Jasmine. I mean, those are really interesting points. It is fantastic serendipity to have this book at a time like this. I know, Sunisa, you wouldn't pretend that the timing was all planned. We're really looking forward to this first reading, I think, from 1973, when two of the characters, Chang and Lek, are involved in the protest. But perhaps you could say a little bit about the three characters before you read that, so that our audience has some sense of the dynamic between these three characters already in 1973 before you do that reading.
Sure, I'd love to. So the novel is narrated by three different characters, three point of view characters. Det, short for Ditkat, is the main character. He's descended from royalty, so he's of the nobility, he's titled, Thai, as we say. He gets to be friends with Chang, who's from Klong Toi, and they meet in officer training camp with the National Lottery. And so that's, an instance where two people of very different kind of births within the hierarchy of Thai society get a chance to even just meet each other and become friends. They both go to Chula, where they meet Lek, who's Chinese Thai. Her parents are immigrants from China. And she's, like Chang, actually, has been going to the top schools in the country on scholarship. And so they become the triumvirate that lead us into and through the novel.
Okay, let's have that first reading, if you'd like to do that for us.
Great. So if you have the book and want to follow along, it's page 81. And I had to begin with this reading because this happens on the 14th of October, 1973. This is Chang and Lek going into those protests. Doesn't get more serendipitous than this. Chang and Lek round onto Ratchadamnern Avenue. She gasps. It looks like the whole city has turned out. People are shoulder to shoulder, spilling over roads, sidewalks, and the mound between streets. Citizens add color to the black and white uniforms of students. Chang even spies the long skirts of high school students. They're so young to take such risks. "Do you see this?" he screams, but of course she does. They clutch each other's hands. Many people carry wooden sticks with images of the king and queen, so that there's a second parade of portraits wobbling above the ribbon of black hair. They're almost at Democracy Monument. Lek cuts across the shuffling crowd by climbing into a bank of bougainvillea. She hitches her skirt around her knees and sinks into the orange and white blossoms with her arms spread wide. Lek strokes forward. When Chang plunges in, he realizes there's a reason no one is taking this shortcut. Thorns. Then she's through, brushing herself off with the help of a few people, for holding her bag and laughing as Chang struggles in the tangle. Democracy Monument is the spoke of a large roundabout. 4 tapered pillars angle out, thick wings beating demons away, guarding the central red and gold protrusion. A double stack of golden bowls crowns the nubby structure. As they crest the first steps of the monument, Chang makes out students and soldiers, civilians and officials molded in the plaster plinths. The heroes of 1932, when the kingdom became a constitutional monarchy and democracy was seated. A wing throws thankful shade. Lex sinks down, smiling at someone who makes room for them. The loudspeaker shrieks, then subsides into a pouty crackle. The student leader yells, vocal cords picked out in his neck as he demands the expulsion of the tyrants. Nothing short of exile will guarantee fair elections. The crowd cheers. Chang lets out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Up close is where he wants to be. A police car edges into the crowd, who lift their portrait sticks in response, and the leader starts to chant, "We love policemen, they're our parents, it's someone else we don't like." As the crowd repeats the call, the car reverses. "Don't forget to take your dictators with you," someone calls, and the crowd laughs. Everything seems possible with this many people. The beaming face of the crowd matched the benevolent smile of the monarch hovering over them.
Thanks very much. Det, of course, was perhaps the pivotal character in your book. I found him the most interesting character, having lived here a long time. You know, a young man who's acutely conscious of his royal ancestry, which gives him a sense of duty, and from a rather, top-down point of view, but he's highly influenced by his super bright, very charged girlfriend, Lek, who is infused with the spirit of radicalism at the time, and his struggles to meld those together really run right the way through the book. Can you talk us a little bit about Det? And I understand that he was the one character who your American publishers thought would be most difficult to sell over there.
Yes, actually the book hasn't sold in the US, much to my disappointment, and my agent's disappointment, I should say. But a major comment we got was that I needed to cut Det from the book. They wanted Lek and Chang, particularly Lek, who's very charming and very charismatic. But of course, to me, if you cut Det, you lose the complexity of the novel. It's not an imaginative stretch to figure out why 2 students who are relatively poor and without access would radicalize and want more opportunity in a small country like Thailand, a small kingdom. Why Det would, someone with access, opportunity, connections, everything in life is really going in his favor. And Det, to me, is the question. We needed to see his journey and see his friends pull him into a journey. And I think particularly in Thailand's case, one, because we have a nobility, but also there, in my experience, there can be a strong sense of duty in families, in society, towards the country. These are things that I really did want to portray, right? Like, what is it that we owe the society we come from? And Det is the character that is most concerned with that.
He is quite complex. I mean, he goes through different phases in the book, doesn't he? Where he's quite standoffish about the radical activities of his close friends. Then, in a way, he almost takes them over, and he becomes suffused with a determination to throw himself into it, even when he discovers from his father that there could be a cost to that his own status isn't as secure as he thought. It's an incredible complexity going on, and he's full of contradictions and conflicting pressures, isn't he?
Yeah, aren't we all? I mean, there's a couple things happening there. One, these are very young people, and I want to offer my characters the respect they deserve, but I think there's a lot of supercharged feelings that can lead them to what later might be called rash decisions, but they're really fun to read about, I hope. So there's some of that. I think right in the beginning of the book, Det loses his mother, who's this anchoring figure in his life. And when you're an adolescent and that happens, that can really also throw you off balance. So from a craft perspective, as a creative writer, I was trying to find the things I needed to throw Det off balance enough to justify some of the directions he was going to go in. But I do want to say that I love this character. I mean, his sensitivity leads to an idealism that's very unique, very different from what Chang and Lek are able to do.
I agree, and it comes across as very authentic because it is complex. Look, I know we're going to have another reading. We've sort of scheduled this here, but actually I wanted to ask Jasmine something else about today's generation of protesters. I mean, I was out today with, and actually there were lots of ages there, but it is young-led. And I was talking to a group of young people who had a couple of posters, one in English, one was in French. And their passionate idealism and their anger and their willingness to talk about, really bluntly, to the BBC about the monarchy. They're wearing face masks, but it is so unprecedented for me as a journalist who's covered this country off and on for 20 years. I don't remember a time where students were as excited and as motivated as they are now. I mean, in terms of the historical context, Jasmine, I mean, I don't think 1992 was anything like this. I mean, do we have to go back to the 1970s before we see students as invigorated by politics as they are today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two things to that, right? First, I think we're dealing with a monarchy that is fundamentally different from one that we in our lifetimes have seen, and I think Jonathan, in your lifetime of covering Thailand, have seen. That sort of, before in 1973, even when people were talking about the reform of the monarchy, it was an intensely socially contested question, just because of the weight that King Rama IX held in Thai society. I think today, I won't say much, but that dynamic is quite different now. Just, that sort of conflict between society and protester doesn't quite exist. And I think that's emboldened the protesters to feel very comfortable and justified in making these demands, which from any perspective does sound justified. So I think the monarchy, that change is really key in terms of seeing why people are much more willing to speak about that. But I think sort of the second thing is that I think it's difficult to sort of take this in abstract of the geopolitical context, right? In 1973, you had this upsurge of Marxism that was filtering through Thai society. I think today you're beginning to see, this socialist conversation come back. And I think that's what really excites people, right? Is this idea of sort of wholesale reform and wholesale change that is promised by a lot of these leftist ideologies. And that's not something that was really centered in any of the other protests, which were a lot more, related to key political figures or key political tensions within Thai society alone. So I think those, to me, are the two key components, which really drive this huge change. But probably the first is a bigger driver than anything else.
Sunisa, what were the big literary influences when you wrote this book? I've heard you refer to War and Peace as a favorite novel, but were there others?
Yes, definitely. If I could talk about War and Peace for a minute, it is my favorite novel. And it was a big influence on this novel because, one, I stole the triumvirate from War and Peace. And so you have Pierre, who's bumbling and sensitive, maybe not so compelling in the beginning, but hopefully much more heroic as the work progresses. You have Prince Andre, who's so dashing, and maybe a little too inflexible, so idealistic that he misses some of the wins that could have occurred if he was a little bit more flexible. And I think flexibility is key in Thai culture. And then you have Natasha Lek, very similar, very charismatic, the love interest of both of them, to give that away. And there's this wonderful scene in War and Peace where Natasha does this dance that somehow she shouldn't know how to do, but she does because she's infused with the spirit of Russia, which sounds ridiculous until you read it. But I really tried to give Lek some of that verve and that sort of, you can't quite explain why, but I think, we all fall in love with Lek, right? A couple other books that were influences. Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. It's an English novel. Really helped me figure out how to write this book. I stole the third person present tense from those novels. I think the third person, this is a craft thing, is very appropriate for Thai because, of course, when we speak about ourselves in Thai, it's like we're using the third person. I would say Sunisa thinks this, and it wouldn't be strange in Thai, right? So I always like the third person for this. And then the present tense so that we have that sense of immediacy and being swept up in what is a historical moment. I didn't want it to feel far away. These characters are in the moment. There's no frame where one of them is looking back however many years later and, reflecting on the follies or victories of their youth. And then the third book that I really love and was an influence is Botans Letters from Thailand. I read the translation by Susan Kepner. It's amazing. It was published in the 60s, and it's about Chinese Thai life in those very early days, kind of the first moments in lifetime of assimilation. And I just found it so fresh and funny. And I think it's a masterpiece, actually, if people haven't read it. And that book, in a funny way, gave me permission to just go for it and write the story, set entirely in Thailand with only Thai characters and just be like, no, it's possible. And it's been done very well already.
Well, obviously, one of the big characters, although he's not actually alive in your book, is Chit Pumisan, this radical figure who, of course, today's students are also referring back to. In your book, he's very important for Lek, but I'm trying to remember whether it was, as you put in your book, where Chit's works were completely buried and unknown, and in a way what we see is your generation of activists discovering his incredibly radical recommendations for Thai society that the current generation are discovering when they read the works of Ajahn Somsak in France, who are challenging the monarchy, that sense of excitement that we've discovered something, a path. I mean, just talk a little bit about Chit Pumisan and how the role in his book, and then perhaps give us that reading you were going to give us, I think, on page 50. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Page 50. Chit Pumisak is an intellectual, Thai radical intellectual that I didn't hear much about growing up, and maybe that's my upbringing, but Jasmine, chime in on this in a minute. I mean, it's my sense that he was a little bit lost for a while. When I did research into this period of the 70s, though, he was everywhere. He's an intellectual that was assassinated in the 60s, and the 70s generation was really inspired by his work. So I wanted to make his writing and his thoughts, some of his thoughts anyway, a through line in the novel and leave a trail so that people could stumble upon Chit through my book. Of course, now that's not really needed. I think students have, they've got him and they see him, and that's wonderful. But he's one of the two poles that pull my characters through the novel. If you look at the beginning of the novel, there's it's not a dedication, epigraph. There's an epigraph from King Chulalongkorn about democracy, and then there's one from Chit, and they play with each other and against each other. It's an argument the characters make. So I'm going to read this section, page 50, Chang again. And what I want to say about it is that you'll notice that because this book is in English, I'm trying to also enact what it's like to be under a repressive government and be censored. And so that's part of what the scene is doing. The high school library at Triam Udom Suksa was an open-air teak panel rotunda. Chan thought this was a bad idea. The kingdom's humidity-rotted pages, what if something was damaged before he got to read it? He knew he wasn't the only person who worried over the state of the books at the school, because every time he showed up to borrow the short biography of Chit Pumisak that was reputed to be in the school's possession, it was checked out. Finally, after a patient interlude, Chang interrogated the librarian. "I'm looking for a book," Chang announced, bouncing on his toes. "Aren't we all?" The elderly lady had thin shoulders and large glasses, her lips a reedy line. "Well, can you help me find it?" he blurted. "You ask nicely." Chang sputtered. "Stop bouncing," she said, and looked up. "Tell me what you're looking for and I might help." "Oh, right." But he wasn't sure how to ask. Chit Pumisak's work was banned. Chang had heard of the dissident in the pages of the Social Science Review, and then from upperclassmen who talked about this book, Who is Chit Pumisak, which covered the years from when Chit entered Chula to when he was assassinated, reputedly by the CIA. That was legend. Chang wanted biography, but how was he going to get his hands on anything when it was illegal and dangerous to talk about it? It had been minutes since the librarian's question, and Chang blushed. He was an organized kid, and in his systematic way had thumbed through the tabs of the school's card catalog every 2 weeks, waiting for Who is Chit Pumisak to appear in the narrow box. In the absence of the expected, Chang did not have a plan.
Thanks very much, Sunisa. Jasmine, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of literature in Thailand. We're all re-investigating the history now and looking back at sort of debates that have been. I don't think many people outside of Thailand, indeed many people inside Thailand, are very aware of a strong literary tradition, or political literary tradition, of political literature. I mean, are there other works of literature written in Thai that have inspired political movements or got people very excited?
Yeah, absolutely, Jonathan. That's a great question just because there is such a good answer to it. I think first to Sunisa's point about, Jit Pumisak during the 1970s, I think it was true that his work was censored, but I think his work was widely available at Thammasat's Tha Prajan campus, which is usually where all the censored books are available anyway in Thailand. But, during the 70s was sort of this real opening in terms of Thai literature, and there was a lot of Marxist literature, not just Jit Pumisak, but there were other authors as well, writing in these oblique ways that I think, Sunisa brings up, right? Bringing up all these metaphors. So a core part of the 1970s was the publication of the Social Science Review out of Zula University. And the Social Science Review would be sort of a journal for the most radical thoughts taking place in Thai society. It wasn't a book necessarily, but the editors who published the Social Science Review then became sort of the core group of student leaders in 1973 as well. And that's why the issue of sort of reviews or magazines became so important for the government. The reviews and magazines were where students were sharing a lot of this censored literature, where students were sharing a lot of these thoughts, and also literature from abroad, from Cuba, especially. There were lots of translations from PRC. And so sort of the crux of the 1970s movement was when the government began cracking down on this literature. And that was when the students decided, we're going to have to come out and protect our freedom of speech. So really, I would say maybe 1973 was a protest about literature. But yes, there were all these really, really fascinating books that were published at the time. I did have a question for Sunisa, actually, sort of based on the Jit Pumisak reading. And so, as you wrote this book, you mentioned that it moved between reality, real history, and sort of, the world of fiction, right? And you note in your author's note these 3 changes that you made. For example, having the king appear at the protests when they actually didn't. So why did you feel like making these changes? And do you feel like the Thai audience might respond differently than an American audience to this sort of divergence between reality and literature?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting the feeling that they will, but it remains to be seen. I'm asking for a lot of permission because this is a fictional work. It's a novel. And I wanted to tell a good story, meaning fun, entertaining, and one that it's a real aim, and one that also maybe translates things a little bit more than a Thai audience would need. A couple reasons. I'm writing it in English, so I'm not expecting a wholly Thai audience, although I do hope Thai people who can read the novel will. But 2, I also write I wrote this book entirely from California, where I live. And for me, that distance was important. I think we'll get into that later. But I wanted to make a couple things more explicit and enact them in the story in a way that if it was in Thai, 1, I probably couldn't because of political reasons and political dangers. But 2, Thai people are really good at reading the metaphor, the painting behind me. And foreigners might not be because they don't have to be because, in the US, we still have freedom of the press. And so the biggest change I did, which I know my dad objects to, is having the king and queen come out and give food and water to the protesters in '73. It's a huge change. But what I wanted to get across was that the monarchy was seen as supporting the '73 protesters, and it's a novel, so I didn't want to just say that, right? Like, once you read that food and drink has been shared and that the protesters took shelter in Jeddah, which I think they did, then you get that message pretty clearly.
Yeah, it's interesting, that issue of bringing the monarchy in. It's always the most troublesome element in anything you do in Thailand. I mean, there is a contested narrative, Sunisa, about 73 and 92. The official Thai version is, at a time of acute crisis, King Bhumibol stepped in and solved the problem. There's another narrative which says actually he was caught by swirling powers that he wasn't fully in control of, and actually waited quite late to intervene in both cases, especially in 92, where a lot of people died before he was sure which way it was going. There's this other side that says actually, King Bhumibol always endorsed coups because he kind of went with whichever way the prevailing power was going. Were you very aware of those contested narratives, which are very sensitive here in Thailand because of his revered status, when you made the decisions about how you were going to introduce the king and queen into the book?
Yes. Yes. I will say that for me, living abroad has allowed me to access things, and also there's a psychic distance to read and think through things that I think I wouldn't have been able to do the same way living in Thailand. Obviously, lots of protesters, do this within Thailand. But yes, I was aware of that.
And what about your decision to write in English? I mean, is it because you're more comfortable writing in English? And also that feeds into the other point about you, which is you are half Thai. You're a mixed culture, as many people are now. But when you're mixed culture, it's not just having a foot in both camps. Your identity is always tugged. You've got two different pulls on you as well. How did that influence your writing, knowing that Thai culture is so incredibly different from American culture. So you're straddling a very big gap just in your existence.
Yeah. I wrote this book in English. It's the only language I could have written it in, so that solves that. And I wanted to because, gosh, there's not a lot of Thai literature available in English, and yet a lot of people come to live there, and visit. And I wanted to just offer one more authentic thing that doesn't objectify the people in the country, but that inhabits us with complexity and talks about something that we don't really talk about to outsiders as well. I think the thing about being Lukrung, and there are a lot of Lukrung, and increasingly we're all mixed race, right? Is that, Jazz, I'm stealing an answer here, but we're both, but usually I find we're counted as neither. In my life in the US, the dominant society, which is white so far, looks at me and sees a woman of color, and they'll say, "What are you?" And in Thailand, when people see me, they mostly will reference the fact that I'm half white, and they can see that. And so bizarrely, I feel sometimes counted as neither, but being both and being in a liminal space, I think, gives you a great distance from which to comment as an artist and work as an artist.
Yeah, one thing I'll say, Sunisa, is, that choice of having the king and queen come out, which I think, some people will be surprised by. Jonathan, you'll remember 1992 and that image of General Sutinda Gaifayun kneeling in front of the king, and just what an impact that made, right? And sort of, I think that, I almost thought that was an indirect reference to the 1992 statement that the king made there. And so I think there is definitely historical precedent for that. But, I think on the point of metaphors, right, all of 1973 literature were these basically oblique metaphors to Marxism. And so I think that it does make a lot of sense to try to make these things a little clearer to a non-Thai audience. But as you do think about, writing for a Thai audience, right, what do you think are some of the things that people will be getting out of this book that they might not from, books that are already written in Thai about this period?
Yeah, I think that's a question for you, Sunisa, in a way, because I also felt it was a book that was brilliant for somebody who knows Thailand, but was written in a way that would appeal very much to somebody versed in Western traditions of literature. And I also wasn't sure if it were translated into Thai, how well it would go down here, whether it would fit the way in which Thais are used to reading novels as much as they read novels at all, which of course is not a very strong point in this country. What did you feel about that, Sunisa?
No, I don't think people love to read novels, but if it were translated, I really did try to make it like kind of epic, very entertaining political page turner, if it's not a contradiction. So I hope Thai people will have a lot of fun reading it. My aim, I can't really say how it will fit in the pantheon of stuff already published in Thai literature because I mostly haven't been able to read a lot of it because I have to read in translation. If Thai people are looking for work on October 6th, there is great work on it. And I need to hold up Thongchai Winichkun's memoir history book, Moments of Silence. He was at the club virtually recently on October 6th. This wasn't available when I was writing my book, but there's certainly now work out there that you can reference. For me, with Thai people, I hope they feel seen. You know, when I was doing research into this and I got to interview former activists and I went up to Puhin Rongkha to do kind of tramp around the jungle where the communist encampments were. People were stunned, surprised, and a little skeptical that anyone would want to read about this period. I think those involved, the ones I talked to, felt like it had been thoroughly covered up and deliberately forgotten. And there was a lot of grief over that. And I just hope people see that it's not about me, but that this period happened and it counts. And in fact, it counts very much today for what's happening in Thailand today.
I think the covering up, the bits of Thai history that have been, not talked about much, it's been a very strong character of this. I mean, not just Thailand. I mean, I was based in Indonesia for a long time, and there the terrible bloodletting of the mid-1960s was also covered up, and you couldn't talk about it even if you were related as a victim, because it was seen as a great trauma that was so bad that to go into it again would cause pain and chaos and disharmony. And I feel that Thais, for a long time, have lived in a society where there's a powerful official narrative, particularly about the royal family, that you cannot contest. You take the way it's presented to you and you're told it's good for you, and for a very long time people accepted that, but that kind of filtered down so that there was it almost goes through the education system. This is the official version, this is the way it should be, this keeps harmony in society, don't look into it. And that for particular people, for example, who experienced the horrors of 1976 meant that their experiences were wiped out, they were rubbed out, they vanished. And we are seeing a generation now trying to challenge that, but they're going up against a very deeply ingrained tradition here and in many other countries which says you have an official version because that way you avoid conflict, you avoid digging into painful bits of history, and that to do the Western thing, exposing everything, is going to cause too much trouble and too much anguish. Do you think that tradition, that Thai way of looking at things, is durable, or is it being challenged now? That could go to
It's certainly being challenged now. I think the idea that the West is all so good at being direct is a little false. Let's complicate matters by talking about slavery in America. What does the truth and what does the movement for Black lives come out of but the fact that the United States is yet to reckon with this legacy, and the fact that generally Black Americans don't have full citizenship in this country? There's a narrative in the States, too, about papering over that, moving on. It's been so long. And that's not an option, I think, for a lot of Black intellectuals writing now. And, I love James Baldwin. And you read him in the 50s and the 60s, and he's just like, if you're Black, that's not an option. I think the question for Thailand and the States is, what does truth and reconciliation look like? Notice the first part of that is truth. There are ways in which, this is transformative justice, right? Restorative justice. There are ways in which we could address the past, not necessarily with blame, but we need to acknowledge what happened for people to heal, and not just individual people, although this book is about individual people, but for the social fabric to heal. If we're so intent on harmony and peace, which are noble intentions for sure in a, Buddhist country, we say, I think that real Dharma can acknowledge what's there as well and the suffering that was caused so that we can build a stronger society that has roots in justice. And if you ask Thai people probably protesting, they might not feel like the events of the 70s were so far away from where they are now.
You have a view on that, Jasmine?
Yeah, no, I mean, that sort of begs the question, right? What you think the political role of this book can be in sort of highlighting some of these things. The thing that I found most interesting about the book, for example, is that it resurfaces some of these memories of Buddhism's involvement in the 1973 protests, right? And that hasn't really been an element of calls for reform today. And so, what do you think this book can offer to the current conversation?
A couple things. I think I put what is true, which is that the Sangha, the official Sangha, was involved in October 6, 76. And we see that today, literally Buddha Isara is being used also by the state.
He was out there today, actually. Yeah.
Sorry?
He was out there today, Buddha Isara and his people. Yeah, that was what got us all worried.
And of course, Isara means freedom.
Yeah.
So, I think it's deeply taboo to even acknowledge the political role of the Sangha, although the Sangha is political and politicized. And not just on one side, by the way. That's true on both sides. I think this novel, my feeling around novels in general, with the massacre of October 6th, too quickly does history devolve into statistics, and that becomes kind of a neutral argument about how many students really died. In a way, it doesn't matter. What I'm trying to do with this novel, and what I think fiction can do beautifully, is personalize the tragedy so that when October 6th happens in this book, I hope, because you've been on a journey, and I'm not saying that any of the main characters necessarily die in the massacre, but that you are able to mourn the way that people who were there mourn and have your heart broken for what happens, because it's not about how many people died, it's about the fact that they did.
I know we want to go to questions fairly soon, so if any of you've got questions, think them up now. There's a microphone just sitting at the back there, and feel free to use it. For those of you who are watching this being streamed on Facebook, you can write your questions down on our Facebook page, and we will get to them. But Sunisa, you had, I think, one last reading to give us from page 331, didn't you? And we're talking about 1976 now, aren't we?
Yep. So I'm going to start on 331 and jump around. This is after October 6th happens. I could never read this to a Western audience, I want to note, but since within Thailand, hopefully, what October 6th is, here's afterwards. Flutters of the past sweep by, brushing Lek with old innocence. There's a Lek taking her first shot with Tao, and a Lek whose favorite activity each week is coming up with a new pseudonym that will cloak her writing in safety, so she thought. That Lek's ambition was met by a massacre. No, she can't call it massacre. That's a tidy name. The killings are a blank black wall that swells and engulfs. Certain things conjure it, like the sight of metal folding chairs. Then the cold rises, the wall is there, and her mind skips. It skips the groove of the memory. It declines to play music, declines to listen, declines even to hear. There's a saying Thais like to give about their country. In the water, there's fish. In the field, there's rice. Nainami pla, nainami cow. It's a saying of plenty and ease, of peace and fellow feeling. Lek isn't from the kingdom, so she hasn't swallowed the myth, but still now it catches in her throat the thing she saw when she ran through Thammasat. No myth or story or saying can banish those horrors from her dreams. This isn't a peaceful one. It's a kingdom. It's a brutal one. Disturb the old order with ambition for something bigger, and everyone dies. I'm going to go to 338, not to leave you on that note. Chang teases Lek. What's all this paper? Have you uncovered another trove of Jitpumisak's work? It's mine, Lek says. She explains that she's writing a book. She feels sheepish to admit it. Who is she to write this story, and why would she believe people will read it? But Chang is thrilled. It's a brilliant idea. In the specifics of their story, maybe other people will recognize their own longing to change the status quo. Maybe they will rise up, Chang says, and shout to make sure the government accounts for them. Chang pauses. And if we fail, the book will be an artifact for the future, so people can try again.
Thank you very much, Sunisa. So you've had some samples of the book. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to put to either Sunisa or Jasmine? If you do, park yourselves over there by the microphone. Gwen?
Hi, thanks, Jonathan. I'm Gwen Robinson, President of the Foreign Correspondents Club. Hi, Jasmine. I just saw you sitting here, I think, a few weeks ago, so you do get around. And Sunisa, thanks for the talk. I'm just reading the book, so I'm not very far into it. And forgive me if this question has already been asked, particularly by Jasmine in that excellent interview with you in the Thai Inquirer, but I read a lot this week, so I can't remember if she asked. I was just curious, your characters are so freshly drawn and so immediate and so kind of quirky and engaging and largely likeable. I was just wondering if someone's asked you, are they compendiums of people you know as well as people you have read about, or do you know a Lek or a Det or a whatever? I mean, could you say who the inspirations are for these characters?
Sure, yeah. There aren't any straight inspirations. I've talked a little bit about how Lek's beginnings are based on my mother's, Chinese Thai immigrant, scholarships through school. Brilliant, Mom, if you're watching. But then, of course, Lek radicalizes, and my mother didn't. She went to Chula. She was in Chula in 73, and my uncle was at Thammasat. So some of the historic details I was able to get from my family, but then some not, because they didn't radicalize and they didn't progress that journey. Not a judgment, actually. So yeah, Lek is partially inspired by my mom, Choltira Glatyu. I don't know how to say her name in Thai because I haven't read it in Thai yet. Her arc of radicalization and her work on Chit Pumisak, I borrowed that for Lek, but Lek is younger in the book, right? Lek is in college, not a professor at Chula. Other people. I worked for a Mafalong Foundation up in Doi Tong and at different sites. So I worked with the Diskun family, and some of the life, in a way, of the nobility came from there. But again, not really, because we weren't in the 70s. I had read that nobility radicalized, and I knew I wanted to see why they would do that, because it is contrary to their immediate interests. I borrowed a lot of that from War and Peace, fiction. I made it up.
The scenes in the forests but all three of them, Lek, Dek, and Chang, go out to join the Communist Party. They were very vivid. They felt like somewhere that you knew.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I spent a lot of time in rural Thailand with Doi Tong, with the Mafalong Foundation, and I spent time with farmers and people like Dao, who you don't meet until later in the book, but I absolutely fell in love with being out there. That's a cliche, but Thailand I think is most interesting outside of the big cities myself. So I did that, and then I really spent a couple of days up in Phu Hin Rong Kla and got to see communist encampments, be in the huts where they slept. Like, all those sensory details are things that, as a novelist, I wanted that the history books don't have. I got lost in the jungle, so I had a good couple hours to just cool those heels and look around and think about what it would be like to live in there and get lost. I think the activists were lost quite often. So I had some fun experiences doing that.
Yeah. Christopher.
Hi, I'm Christopher Moore. I very much enjoyed listening to you talk about your book, and certainly about the publishing history in New York and the difficulties you've had. I recall some decades ago, my agent in New York had submitted a novel of mine to a New York publisher that wanted to publish it, and they said they had one request, that they would publish it if I changed Bangkok to Boston in the book. And I replied, and leave everything else the same? And the answer was yes. That gave me some idea of kind of the provincialism of the U.S. publishing at the time. And from the sound of it, it hasn't changed much in the last 30 years. What I'd like to raise is, here as a member of the club, we've had a number of panels of young Thais who are leading the protest and the demonstration. And I've been very impressed by the quality of their speech, the quality of their thought, their reading, and it seems to me that there's a whole new generation of young Thai writers and thinkers and intellectuals who are doing something that I think is very important for this country, and that they are coming up with investigation and evidence that's allowing them to curate the past in a way that's never been curated before. In this country, there's really been a very small number of curators as to what is the past, what's permissible to talk about the past, and what's permissible to think and write about it. And it seems to me your book is a very good example of a breakthrough of that taboo, that there's no longer a single set of curators of the past, that it's now passing to a new generation with new experience, new evidence, and they're looking at what happened in a very different way.
Thank you for the comment. Yeah, I think provincialism is the right word for it. As we said, publishers wanted me to cut dead. I wouldn't do it. And the struggle to publish this book, I hope and think that someday this novel will be published in the West. But I'm very grateful that I found a publisher in Southeast Asia. The novel is being published by Epigram Books in Singapore, and it was a finalist for a prize for Southeast Asian writers. Their stated aim is for Southeast Asian people to be able to read each other, and that we can create our own marketplace regionally. This is especially important for me because, of course, I'm writing in English and, not Thai. So I'm really grateful that Epigram exists and that they've done such a beautiful job with the book, I think, in terms of the cover and the print, and they've edited it beautifully so that this is a decolonizing work, right? Like, we can publish and read ourselves. We don't actually need for the West to think that this is an important story. And, Bangkok Wakes to Rain, Sightseeing, which is probably 15 years ago now, there are a couple books written in English by Thai writers that have made it. So just very few. I think, what you said about curation is interesting and right. And one of the points there is social media, which, Jasmine, maybe you want to jump in, but it's harder to contain and control all the official narratives now.
I think just to sort of give credit to the past as well, newspapers like Prachathai were always out there, telling the truth in the most blunt of words. I think one thing to note, and this is something I've been told by my Thai journalist friends, is that the censors don't usually read in English. And so if you're writing in English, you can usually get away with a lot more than you would writing in Thai. That's the reason why Prachathai has survived till today. That's the reason the Thai Inquirer can publish as it does. And I really do think that's the reason why a good true Thai will be able to say some things that, some novels written in Thai, written by Nithiwit, for example, wouldn't otherwise.
Jasmine, I wanted to ask you something that I've noticed very much about today's student movement, which is how self-consciously historical they are, and how much they are going back through Thai history and creating a narrative that leads to their movement that is completely alternative to the official narrative. They've made a big deal about the plaque that was mysteriously removed, these symbols, but also the 1932 revolution. They're talking a lot. Today, I was out there, people coming up, giving me names of people who took part in that revolution that I've hardly even thought about. They're looking for a different history, and this is a battle about history that we're seeing now, and which, to some degree, it was in the 70s as well.
Yeah, I think, to your point that Thai people don't read a lot of novels, Thai people read a lot. They're just not always novels, right? So they're always reading history. I think, Sunisa, you mentioned that Jit Kumisak's work was mostly as songs, right? And there are a lot of those today, those fragments of history that are floating across social media that will instantly become viral. I think, 1932 is a great example where someone unearthed didn't unearth, but decided to commemorate this history with a hashtag on Twitter. And then it was instantly reclaimed by the movement, even though, from my perspective, 1932 was, it was still a coup of royalists and military dictators, right? But all it took was a hashtag. And so I think you're right that there's this reclaiming of history with all these new technological ways that people are communicating. And maybe it's not even like a true history, right? But it is a recreation of history that will help make this sort of the next step in the narrative of Thailand's future. But I think, it does come out of this long tradition of Thai protesters being really suffused in the literature, not only of our history, but the history of the world. And I think it comes out of that sort of very thoughtful ambition of the Thai high schooler and the Thai university student.
Yeah. Sunisa, your the way you write is very literary. I mean, it's a beautifully written book, and it's occasionally challenging. The pace changes quite a bit. When you're writing a book that is a work of literature that is created, you're living through your characters, but you're also very conscious of the history. Do they fight with each other? The need to push the history out there to it has a political role, a book like yours, sort of peeling back layers, getting people involved in what was a very politicized period, at the same time that you're trying to create a balanced work of literature with real characters who excite people and involve them, and all their emotions and their personal development comes through. Is that conflict with you all the time?
Yes, in this novel. It's something I really struggled with, and is one of the reasons I think it took me so long to write the book, because there is so much politics, and the more I read, the more there was stuff that you just couldn't make up, like the helicopter crash that Jasmine mentioned, that I wrote and rewrote and wrote, and finally was like, I can't keep it in. I had to eventually settle on my commitment to lead with the art and to give myself permission, which Botans novel did for me, to just, do a lot of research and then toss and forget and change a little bit what I needed. The major pieces of this period are all true, because I also knew, for folks who didn't know about the 70s period, that this might be the first time they were encountering it. But I felt like for the book to work and succeed as a work of art, I just had to let it do that.
Can we have the next question, please?
Yes. Hi, Sunisa. So I think as a Thai and fellow half-Thai, kind of on the opening chapter of the book, I'm curious as to why you decided to start with death. I think it's a hard topic, right, for a Thai to kind of jump into a book with, and it's something that I have to say you are able to kind of ease through that tough emotion, but it was actually hard to kind of start to digest that this is the moment at the beginning of your story.
I agree. Yeah. It was quite a tough beginning, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Hi, this is one of my dearest friends. Hello, Ash. Thanks for a good question. I appreciate the feedback, too. It's interesting. So I thought it'd be really hard to start with this death, the death of Det's mother, and it's a very hard, kind of gruesome funeral scene. From a Thai perspective, that's hard. There's a joke my agent and I had that to sell the book, I'd have to open with a death to try to hook people in the West. It didn't work, but also it's funny, when we talk about the two cultures. I knew I needed to open the book with Det and his mother and close the book with Det and his mother, but she's not alive, in this time, so it necessitated that. This is a very Buddhist book. I'm a practicing Buddhist, actually Tibetan Buddhist, but it begins the thing about rising and falling, which is, of course, class-based, but also this idea of karma. I think in Thailand, karma can be used to justify your place in society, to the detriment of members of society who are not born high up on those social rungs. And so it begins the whole conversation. And because Det's mother chooses to have a more modest funeral than she could, right away we're within the conflict in Det's life, right? Right away we're within the things that he will start to discover pretty quickly.
One thing that I felt about Det, Sunisa, is he's steeped in hierarchy, of his awareness of his background, for all that we find out that it's not quite as secure as he thought. and being a great grandson of Chulalongkorn. You're fascinated by hierarchy. Living here in Thailand, we're incredibly aware of how constricting hierarchy can be for the need for social progress, for younger Thais. And yet, Det is your main character, and he actually believes, really, in that hierarchy right through the book. He never really loses that belief, does he? It's almost as though you're quite sympathetic to his notions of hierarchy.
I'm sympathetic to Det, but my two other characters, Chang and Lek, don't, particularly Chang in this case, don't buy into that at all. I wanted that tension in the book. And so much of the student movement is against the tension of the hierarchy that I wanted a very strong character that believed in it. A lot of Thai people do, right? That's why Det is in the book the way he is. And Thai is a language, someone correct me, but I think that enforces hierarchy. As soon as I speak in Thai, I'm placing myself somewhere and I'm placing you somewhere. This is hard to convey in English because it's not just formal, informal address. It's like two ladders, and it's judgmental that way. And I change personally when I speak Thai, right? I get more, I was speaking to my mom about this yesterday, soft and pliant. It's very gendered language. I have to gender myself the way that Thai womanhood is gendered. I think this is complicated. So I thought it was really important to have one character that buys into this whole system, because we have to see the system as well in order to have the other characters try to change it.
Jasmine, I've been watching these protests here at this time in Thailand, and there's such a buzz, such an excitement among these young people that they've broken a taboo, that they're talking about everything, that they feel they've got momentum with them. And when you look back at Thailand's past, whenever we've had these sort of upwellings of desire for change, they've ended tragically. When you talk to today's students, I mean, I talk to them, and they're all happily saying, "Oh, I'm happy to give my life." And I think, well, very few people really are. When it comes to it, as a journalist, every time I've ever seen real clashes and bloodshed, it's horrible. It scars societies. It leaves pain that lasts for generations. It's not something you welcome. Is Thailand doomed to end its periods of upheavals in the way that we saw it in the 1970s? Or could we see a new generation finding an alternative way of getting change without having some awful convulsion?
Yeah, I think, two key points here. First, sort of to the point of the importance of Det's character, I think what we see on the streets, it looks like there's a lot of people out there. But when you talk to people who aren't out there on the streets, there's still a stronghold of Thai opinion that believes that the hierarchy makes sense, right? There are still parents who are shocked that high schoolers are out there saying, we shouldn't have to respect people older than us for no reason. And there are still people who really truly believe that the respect for teachers is, more important than teaching kids critical thinking, right? And so I think that there are all these elements in Thai society that will sort of be stretched to their limit, as they always have with every sort of leftist movement, and then will eventually snap back. I think, the second important thing to think about is that the current king has never hidden his love for the military and his willingness to use the military to execute certain things. He himself has been far more active than Rama IX, even, in being really explicit about cracking down on protesters. I think the disappearance of Wanchalom is a great example of that. And so it's hard not to see this as sort of a matter of time. A question that I had for Sunisa, and I don't know if there are people ready to ask questions, but I think this is an important question, is how did you write this book with your infant? I know we talked about it before, but I think that's such an important part of thinking about how this book came into existence.
Oh my goodness, thank you for this question. A lot of credit to my partner who fought for this book as hard as I did, equally, definitely. A lot of the book was written by the time our son was born, but then I went through extensive revisions because it didn't sell in the States, and we revised it. I revised it and then sent it to Epigram too. It was really hard. We got some childcare. My husband watched our baby, and I just, you learn, I think, as an artist, what's really important to you once you become a mother, because time changes and your energy levels change. And I learned that I need writing and reading, and so we just had to make that happen.
I do have one question here from someone who's watching on Facebook. It's the kind of question you often get to writers, because I think people are fascinated when they go through a book, working out what was tough for you. So it's a very simple question. What was the hardest chapter to write? Was there any one chapter that really challenged you, and if so, why?
Wow. That's a hard question to answer. I think there is, but I can't give it away. So it's, I'll just say that I spent so much time with these characters. It's like they became family members. And sometimes writers say this thing, it's like, oh, they're talking in your head. And it's like, what does that mean? But you get used to people, huh? And they lived with me for a long time. But yeah, I think probably, this book, at one point, it really breaks my heart. And maybe you'll feel that when you read it. It's a little later in the book. I'll try to give you some clues. I think I thought a lot about class in the book and why someone would radicalize who's from a higher class. And there's a lot of commentary on that later in the book when everything comes to a head.
I mentioned the countryside earlier, but one of the contexts for your book is the Communist Party of Thailand. And I find that the history of the party in Thailand fascinating because, we're all aware of what happened in Indochina and the Khmer Rouge and in Vietnam. And for people like me who've studied Indonesia, we know what happened to the Communist Party there. I mean, Thailand was fascinating. There was a very active communist insurgency, and then it just kind of filtered away with the amnesties in the 80s. And yet when I go out today, not just this one, but all the red shirt protests in the past, the awareness of the presence of the Communist Party and what it did for quite a long time out in large parts of Thailand is incredibly high. The hunger among younger people to look back on it, the use of communist symbols, even when you go up to parts of Isan, and places where the Communist Party was very, very strong, Sakon Nakhon, I've asked people, the older people, how when they're doing their red shirt activities, how is this connected? Is there a link to the Communist Party? They said, oh yes, of course we all know about the party. They were here, they were there. We knew this person, this village. They made a distinction always because the red shirts always said we're for democracy, and we see communism in Laos next door, and it's not the same thing. But did you learn a great deal more about the Communist Party and its role in Thailand, which otherwise you wouldn't, if you're living in Bangkok, you wouldn't hear much about it?
No, I'd love to throw this to Jazz in a minute to talk about the Communist Party if you want, but yeah, I did. Like I mentioned, I work for Mat Phalong Foundation, and afterwards in my research came to see some of Rama IX's rural development efforts as countering the work that the Communist Party did in the countryside, because that's where, in some ways, the ideological battle was really being fought. Luckily, that monarch seemed to really like that work too. So that was part of it. I did a lot of research into the Communist Party in Thailand. It becomes very interesting once there's a Chinese allied and then Vietnamese allied Communist Party. It happens a little bit after this book ends, in the early 80s. But yeah, I looked into that. I have this section in the book about the research, and I really leaned for the Communist Party stuff on Chris Baker and Pasuk Ponghoijit's scholarship in English. They had a lot to say about that I found really useful.
Yeah, Jasmine, what do you feel about the role of the Communist Party today? It's co-opted so often by protest movements.
Well, the thing is, it's really difficult to understate just how widespread the communist influence was in the 1970s. I think almost everyone's mother or father was a young university student who was part of their university communist party. My mother grew up in Tung in the south of Thailand, like really tiny province. And, she was part of this movement bringing films from Bangkok or even from Chiang Mai down to the south of Thailand. And so it really was something that university students at the time were just a part of. I think like the Black Lives Matter movement, it was this ideological shift that was just seen as natural. Then, you had the fall of Vietnam in 1975, when it actually becomes a communist country. And I think that's the moment when things fundamentally change and the conversation around communist ideology fundamentally changes, right? That's the moment when sort of a vacillating monarchy, one might say, becomes so much more clearly right-leaning, and sort of the moment when the Sangha begins to come out and all these other political figures begin to come out. So I think it's because of what happened in 1975 and then 76, obviously, it's always very difficult to sort of trace back to the early 70s to see this world where people this was just much more a part of Thai history and a part of Thai literature and a part of Thai culture.
And a very important backdrop to the book. Does anyone else have any other questions to ask before I wrap up tonight's proceedings? I hope you'll all take the chance to buy the book. We've certainly had copies for sale up on the desk, and I've seen it for sale in Gason Plaza too if you haven't got it, so a very strong recommendation. Sunisa, is there anything else you'd like to just add at the end of it after we finish this conversation? We've covered a lot of ground on your book.
No. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for such a lively discussion. I really enjoyed it and appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you for getting up so early. And Jasmine, thanks so much for joining us from London. It was a really wonderful and wide-ranging discussion. And thank you all for coming today as well. Is that another question? Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. We've got a last question to slip in here. Please do, and perhaps identify yourself as well.
Sure. My name's Amy. I work in travel, but I have a blog about travel and books. So I wanted to ask Sunisa, this is your debut novel, so are you planning to write another? I know you said this one was quite difficult to write, and if so, would it also be set in Thailand, another period of, that's interesting in Thailand politically or historically?
That's a great one to end on. Thank you. I am working on another book, incredibly, given the pandemic and vagaries of childcare. Yeah, my next book, I promised myself one point of view character, no research, and a contemporary setting so that I can just go into it. I think it's going to be quite short also. This was longer, but this is, not slim. I do love researching though, and I have a couple other book ideas for other periods of Thai history. So I hope to get to that. I just need a little bit of a break as well.
All right, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. And Jasmine and Sunisa, thank you so much for a wonderful evening.